In the unforgiving dust of the Old West, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to secure a husband and disappear into his shadow. But for one woman, her very stature made her an outcast. They called her a giantess, an awkward crane, a woman too tall to ever be a proper wife. Laughed at, scorned, and left for destitute, her story should have ended there, buried in the anonymous dirt of a town, with no pity. But they didn't count on him. They didn't count on the silent, towering man from the Cherokee Nation, a true giant who saw past her height and into her soul. And they never imagined he would build her a fortress of defiance and love with nothing but the forest, his honor, and his bare hands. This is the story of how two outcasts mocked by the world built a home that would bring a town to its knees. The dust of Redemption Gulch had a way of settling on everything, a fine red powder that clung to hope and choked it dead. For Hannah Smith, it felt like a shroud she could never shake off. At 17, standing a whisper shy of 6 feet tall, she was a landmark in a town that prized women for their dainty, compact utility. Her height was not a feature. It was a failing, a public sin she was forced to wear every day. Her parents, God rest their souls, had brought her west, with promises of open skies and a life as big as her spirit. But the cholera that swept through their wagon train had no respect for dreams. It had taken them both in the span of a week, leaving Hannah an orphan in a town that had already made up its mind about her. The mockery wasn't always overt. It was in the way mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, as if her stature were a contagion. It was in the sly grins of the cowboys loitering outside the saloon, their eyes traveling the long line of her frame, with amusement, not desire. It was in the careful adjustments the storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, made, placing the best fabrics and prettiest ribbons on shelves, just low enough that she'd have to stoop ungracefully to see them. His wife, Martha Higgins, was the town's primary narrator of Hannah's misfortune. A lovely face. It's a shame, Martha would sigh to her customers, her voice carrying across the dry goods store. But what man wants a wife who can look him square in the eye, or worse, look down on him? It's unnatural. Poor girls destined to be a spinster, a giant spinster. Hannah learned to make herself smaller. She hunched her shoulders, wore drab, ill-fitting dresses to hide her form, and kept her gaze fixed on the splintered boardwalks. She took what work she could find, mending clothes for prospectors, scrubbing the floor of the church, and tending to the grave of the pastor's wife. The pay was a pittance, barely enough to keep her in the tiny, drafty room she rented above the smithy, a room where she had to sleep curled on her side because the bed was too short. The town's cruelty was embodied by one man, Josiah Croft. Croft owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory, the sprawling Circle C. He was a man of middling height, but immense ego, with a cruel twist to his lips, and a belief that his wealth gave him dominion over all he surveyed, including the people of Redemption Gulch. He saw Hannah as a personal affront to the natural order. The breaking point came at the annual Founders' Day social. It was the one day a year the entire town gathered in the square for music, food, and dancing. Hannah knew she shouldn't go. It was an invitation for humiliation, but a sliver of desperate hope, a yearning to feel like a part of something, propelled her there. She wore her best dress, a simple blue calico she'd painstakingly sewn herself, and stood at the edge of the festivities, a tall, lonely pine tree in a field of wild flowers. Josiah Croft, emboldened by whiskey and his own importance, saw his chance. The fiddler struck up a reel, and couples swirled in the dusty center of the square. Croft strode purposefully towards Hannah, his spurs jingling with menace. The crowd quieted, sensing a spectacle. "Well now, Miss Smithcroft," boomed his voice, dripping with false courtesy. "Standing all alone, a woman of your impressive dimensions must find it hard to find a suitable dance partner." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed a small, wiry ranch hand named Billy. "Billy boy, come here. I'll give you a whole $1 if you can manage a dance with our town giantess without needing a ladder." Laughter erupted sharp and brutal. Billy flushed beet red, a terrified rabbit caught in a snare. Hannah's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like it was peeling her skin from her bones. She stood frozen, a statue of mortification. "Go on, son," Croft urged, shoving the boy forward. But Billy, for all his fear of Croft, couldn't do it. He mumbled an apology and scurried away, swallowed by the jeering crowd. Croft turned back to Hannah, his eyes glittering with malice. "You see, even a boy knows better. You're built for hauling logs, not for a tender embrace. You're simply too much woman. Too tall for a home, too tall for a husband, too tall for Redemption Gulch." Each word was a physical blow. The world swam before Hannah's eyes, the laughing faces blurring into a monstrous fresco of contempt. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. Without a word, she turned and fled, her long strides, usually a source of shame, now her only means of escape. She didn't stop running until the cruel laughter was a faint echo, and the only sound was the frantic pounding of her own heart. She ran past the edge of town, past the last sad-looking homestead, and into the sparse woods that bordered the territory. Tears she had refused to shed in front of them now streamed down her face, hot and furious. She collapsed at the base of a great oak, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear from her very soul. She was done. She couldn't take another day of the whispers, the stares, the suffocating smallness of the town. Croft's words echoed in her mind. Too tall for a home. A home. It was all she had ever wanted. A place of her own, with a door she could shut against the world, a roof that didn't leak, and a bed long enough for her to stretch out. A place to belong. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, a sound broke through her despair. It was a steady, powerful rhythm. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of an axe splitting wood with uncanny precision. Hannah wiped her tears and cautiously moved towards the sound. In a small clearing, a scene unfolded that made her stop in her tracks. A man taller than any she had ever seen stood by a pile of freshly cut logs. He had to be close to 7 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a doorway, and arms corded with muscle. His black hair was long and braided, and his skin was the rich, warm color of polished copper. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his immense size, swinging the axe as if it were an extension of his own arm. This was Samuel Tlanuwa, a man the town knew of but did not know. They called him the Cherokee Giant, a recluse who lived in the woods, traded pristine animal pelts for supplies, and never spoke more than a few words. He was an enigma, another outcast feared for his size and his heritage. He must have sensed her presence. He stopped the axe held loosely in one hand and turned his head. His eyes, dark and deep-set, found hers through the trees. There was no mockery in his gaze, no amusement, no pity. There was only a calm, quiet observation. He had been at the edge of the Founders' Day social. She remembered seeing him, a towering figure, leaning against the farrier's wall, watching everything from the shadows. He had seen it all. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two towering figures on the fringe of a world that had no room for them. In the silence of the woods, far from the suffocating judgment of Redemption Gulch, a desperate, impossible idea began to form in Hannah's mind. An idea born of pure, unadulterated desperation. He built things. He lived out here alone and free. He understood. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Hannah Smith, the woman who had spent years trying to shrink, stood up to her full height and stepped out of the shadows. The silence in the clearing was thick and heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets, heralding the twilight. Samuel Tlanuwa didn't move. He watched Hannah approach with the same unnerving stillness he might afford a deer stepping into his path. His presence was immense, not just physically, but in the sheer weight of his silence. He was a mountain in human form, and she was walking willingly into its shadow. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the familiar misery of her rented room. But the raw wound of Josiah Croft's humiliation was still bleeding, and it had cauterized her fear. She had nothing left to lose. She began, her voice a reedy whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing herself to meet his dark, steady gaze. My name is Hannah Smith. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. I know, he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep in the earth. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak more than a single word. You saw what happened in town. It wasn't a question. Another nod. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and patience. The words tumbled out of her, then a torrent of desperation and resolve. They think I'm a curse, a joke, Mr. Croft said. I'm too tall for a home, that no one would ever build one for me. She took a shaky breath, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. He's wrong. I want a home. A small cabin, that's all. Just a piece of land with a roof and a door. There's an unclaimed plot north of here by the old creek. The soil is poor, no good for farming, so no one's ever wanted it. She looked at the massive stacks of perfectly notched logs he had already prepared, at the powerful axe in his hand, at the raw, untamed strength that emanated from him. I have no money, she said, the admission tasting like ash. I have $14.62 to my name. It's not enough to pay a man. But I am not weak. I can work. I can haul water, strip bark, mix daubing, cook meals. I'll work for you for a year, for 2 years, whatever it takes. I will be your servant, your helper, anything. If you will just build me a house. She finished breathless, her plea hanging in the air between them. She expected him to laugh or to turn away in dismissal. He was an outcast, yes, but he was a man. Why would he help her? Why would he entangle himself in the affairs of a disgraced woman? Samuel rested his axe against a stump and slowly, deliberately walked towards her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. A novel and startling experience. He studied her, his eyes moving from her tear-stained cheeks to her calloused hands to the defiant set of her jaw. He saw not the town giantess, but the grit and fire she had tried so hard to hide. He saw the same stubborn resilience that had allowed his own people to survive unspeakable hardship. You are not a servant, he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through her desperation. And I do not need one. Hannah's heart sank. It was over. A foolish, desperate hope. She felt the tears welling again and fought them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of him, but he continued holding her gaze. A person deserves a place to stand, a place to be. He looked past her towards the spot she had mentioned by the creek as if he could see it already. The soil is poor, but the creek does not run dry. The trees are strong there, oak and pine. He looked back at her. "I will not build a house for you," he said. "We will build a house together." Hannah stared at him, uncomprehending. "Together you are tall," he stated, not as an insult, but as a fact. "You have a long reach. You are strong from your work. You will learn to use it. We will start tomorrow at sunrise." He said it with such finality, such simple authority, that Hannah could only nod her mind, reeling. He hadn't asked for payment. He hadn't demanded her servitude. He had offered her a partnership. He had looked at her greatest shame, her height, and seen it as an asset. The next morning, Hannah arrived at the plot of land by the creek as the first sliver of sun crested the horizon. Samuel was already there, his massive form seeming to draw strength from the earth itself. He had cleared a wide patch of ground, his movements economical and precise. Thus began the most extraordinary weeks of Hannah's life. Their alliance was forged, not in words, but in shared labor. Samuel was a patient and exacting teacher. He showed her how to choose the straightest, strongest trees, how to use a two-man saw their movements, finding a rhythm, a push and pull that became a silent conversation. He taught her how to score a log for hewing and how to use an adze to flatten the sides, the blade biting into the wood with a satisfying thump. Hannah, for her part, was a tireless worker. She did everything he asked and more. Her height, for the first time in her life, was a gift. She could reach higher branches, guide the fall of smaller trees with more leverage, and lift ends of logs that would have strained a shorter person. The muscles in her back and arms, developed from years of thankless labor, now served a purpose she could see and touch. The work was grueling, bone-wearying, but with every log they felled and shaped, she felt a piece of her own spirit being rebuilt. Their days were spent in a cocoon of physical exertion. They rarely spoke, but their silence was comfortable, filled with the sounds of their work, the rasp of the saw, the bite of the axe, the scrape of the debarking knife. He would grunt to signal lift, and she would grunt back in acknowledgement. He would point, and she would understand. In the evenings, she would build a small fire and cook a simple meal of beans and bacon, or a rabbit he had snared. They would eat sitting on a fallen log, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the sky. It was during these quiet moments that she learned more about him. He told her his Cherokee name was Tlanuwa, which meant great hawk. He spoke of the trees as if they were living beings of the forest, as a home that provided all that was needed. He never spoke of the past, of the Trail of Tears, or the reasons for his solitude, but she could feel the weight of a history far heavier than her own in the quiet depths of his eyes. News of their strange partnership spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. It was a scandal, a perversion, a source of endless gossip for Martha Higgins. Can you imagine she'd squawk at the general store, that tall Smith girl out in the woods playing house with the Cherokee giant? It's indecent. Two freaks of nature building a nest for themselves. No good will come of it. You mark my words. Josiah Croft was furious. The sight of Hannah, no longer hunched and ashamed, but striding into town for supplies with sawdust in her hair and a newfound confidence in her eyes, enraged him. He had broken her, and this savage was putting her back together. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a mockery of the social order he policed. One afternoon, he and two of his ranch hands rode out to the building site. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, a tangible wave of menace rolling off them. The foundation logs were already laid, a perfect sturdy rectangle. Well, Croft sneered, his eyes flicking between Hannah and the towering form of Samuel. Quite the little homesteaders. Tlanuwa, I figured you knew your place was to stay hidden. And you, Missy, I warned you this town had no place for you. Samuel didn't even look at him. He continued to notch a log with a chisel and mallet, his focus absolute. Tap, tap, tap. Hannah, however, straightened to her full height, her hands on her hips. The old, cowering girl was gone. This isn't town land, Mr. Croft. It's unclaimed territory. We're breaking no laws. Law. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. I am the law out here, and I say this is an eyesore, a blight. A house of freaks doesn't belong in my valley. He spat on the ground. This little project of yours ends now. Tear it down, or we'll tear it down for you. Samuel finished his notch. He set down his tools with deliberate care, then rose to his full, terrifying height. He turned slowly, and for the first time, fixed his gaze directly on Josiah Croft. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The promise in his eyes was older and more dangerous than any law Croft could invent. It was the promise of a cornered bear, of a storm about to break. Croft's horse shifted nervously. His ranch hands, tough men used to brawling in saloons, suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. The rancher's bravado faltered in the face of that silent, immense threat. This ain't over, Croft snarled, pulling hard on his reins, not by a long shot. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. Hannah's legs felt weak, but she stood her ground. The clearing was quiet again. Samuel turned back to his log as if nothing had happened. But Hannah knew better. A line had been drawn. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was an act of defiance. And Josiah Croft was not a man who tolerated defiance. The foundation was laid, but the storm was coming. Croft's visit was a declaration of war. The idyllic bubble of their shared labor had been pierced, and the poison of Redemption Gulch began to seep in. But instead of frightening Hannah, it galvanized her. The cabin was no longer just a dream of a home. It was a fortress. Every log they hoisted into place was a stone in its walls. Every peg they drove home, a nail in the coffin of her old life. The work intensified. They rose before the sun and worked until the last light failed, driven by a silent, shared urgency. The walls rose with surprising speed. Samuel's knowledge of carpentry was innate, almost artistic. He showed Hannah how to scribe the logs, tracing the unique contour of the log below onto the one that would rest on top, so they would fit together with barely a sliver of daylight between them. Her job, with her long reach and steady hand, was often to guide the massive timbers into place from atop the rising walls, a dangerous perch that she navigated with a newfound fearlessness. Their partnership deepened, evolving beyond the realm of work. She learned the cadence of his breathing, the slight tensing of his shoulders that meant a log was about to shift. He, in turn, learned the determined glint in her eye that meant she was tired but would never admit it. He started leaving a waterskin for her in the shade, or would take the heavier end of a log without comment when he saw her flagging. One evening, as she was mending a tear in her dress by the firelight, she finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Why are you doing this, Samuel, really? You owe me nothing." He was sharpening his axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 a familiar sound. He stopped and looked into the flames. "My people were told they did not belong on their own land," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with history. "They were told they were savages who needed to be moved. They were marched until their feet bled and their spirits broke. They were made to feel small. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of her own pain, magnified 1,000 times. I know what it is to be told you are not right for the world, to be measured and found wanting by people who do not know your heart. He gestured with his chin towards the half-built cabin, its sturdy skeleton dark against the starry sky. This is a good thing, to build a place to stand. It is a thing worth doing. In that moment, Hannah understood that he wasn't just building her a house, he was rebuilding a piece of himself. He was fighting a battle his ancestors had lost, not with weapons, but with an axe and a hammer and an unshakable sense of justice. But their defiance did not go unnoticed. Josiah Croft's rage festered. He was a man obsessed with control, and the sight of that cabin rising day by day was a testament to his failure. It wasn't just about the freaks anymore. A darker, more pragmatic motive was taking root in his greedy heart. One night in the smoky back room of the saloon, he laid out a map for his foreman, a hard-bitten man named Cobb. "Look here," Croft said, stabbing a thick finger at the map. "This is our land, and this," he pointed to the unclaimed plot where the cabin stood, "is this useless patch of dirt." So Cobb grunted. "So you fool look at the creek," Croft hissed. "The one that runs through that plot. Where does it come from?" Cobb squinted. "The high peaks, I reckon." "Exactly. It's spring-fed. All the other creeks in this valley dry to a trickle by late summer. But that one, it never runs dry. I had a surveyor look at it last year on the quiet. We're in a drought, Cobb. It hasn't rained proper in 2 seasons. Water is going to be worth more than gold soon. I need that water source. I was going to file a claim when no one was looking. But now these outcasts are building right on top of it." Cobb's eyes lit with understanding. "So you want them gone?" "I want them erased," Croft corrected him. "I want that cabin gone, and I want them to run so far from here they forget the name Redemption Gulch." The sabotage began subtly. A box of expensive nails vanished overnight. The rope for their pulley system was found one morning frayed and deliberately cut halfway through a deadly trap that Samuel discovered only through his meticulous habit of checking all his equipment at the start of each day. He held up the damaged rope, his jaw tight, and his eyes met Hannah's. The message was clear. This was no accident. They became more vigilant. They took turns keeping watch at night. The fire kept low. The work of building during the day and standing guard at night stretched them to their limits. Hannah, often taking the first watch, would sit on the cabin's unfinished porch, a heavy rifle across her lap, watching the shadows and listening to the profound, steady breathing of the giant sleeping within. In these quiet, dangerous hours, a feeling she dared not name began to grow in her heart. It was a fierce, protective tenderness for the quiet man who had shown her what strength truly was. The final piece of the cabin was the roof. It was the most difficult and dangerous part of the construction. They had to raise heavy ridgepoles and rafters, a task that required all their combined strength and coordination. As they were hoisting the main ridgepole into place, a massive log that would form the spine of the entire structure, it happened. Hannah was on the wall, reaching to guide the pole, while Samuel and their borrowed mule, Samson, strained to lift it from below. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack. One of the support posts beneath Samuel's feet, a post that had seemed perfectly solid, splintered and gave way. It was a trap. The post had been sawed nearly all the way through at its base and packed with mud to hide the cut. Samuel roared, not in pain, but in effort, as the entire weight of the ridgepole shifted onto him. The massive log, hundreds of pounds of solid oak, began to slide towards Hannah. She was trapped with nowhere to go but down. Time seemed to slow. She saw the rough bark of the log sliding, heard the splintering wood, saw the look of ferocious concentration on Samuel's face. He was being driven to his knees, his muscles straining to the point of tearing his body, the only thing between her and being crushed. With a monumental guttural cry that seemed to shake the very trees, Samuel shifted his weight. He didn't try to lift the log. Instead, he drove his shoulder into it, redirecting its fall. Instead of crashing down on the wall where Hannah stood, the ridgepole slammed into the ground just outside the cabin, missing her by inches and shaking the earth with its impact. Samuel collapsed onto his hands and knees, breathing in ragged, heaving gasps. The trap had failed, but only because of his impossible, almost inhuman strength. Hannah scrambled down from the wall, her heart a frantic drum. She rushed to his side. "Samuel, are you hurt?" He shook his head, pushing himself slowly to his feet. He was bruised and battered, his shoulder raw, but he was not broken. He walked over to the shattered support post and examined the clean sword edge now visible. His face was a mask of cold fury. He looked from the broken post towards the direction of the Circle C ranch. The time for silent warnings was over. They had tried to kill him. They had tried to kill her. "Finish the roof," he said to Hannah, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Bar the door. Do not leave the cabin tonight." "Where are you going?" she asked, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. He picked up his axe, its newly sharpened edge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Josiah Croft needs to understand," Samuel Tlanuwa said, "that there are consequences for touching what is mine." And he strode into the woods, a giant going to war. Hannah's blood ran cold as she watched Samuel disappear into the trees. His words, "What is mine," echoed in the clearing, a terrifying and thrilling pronouncement. He wasn't just protecting the house or her. He was protecting them, their shared creation, their unlikely sanctuary. Fear warred with a fierce, newfound resolve. He had told her to finish the roof, to bar the door. It was an instruction, but it was also a test of trust. He was going to face the storm, and he trusted her to hold the fortress. She would not fail him. Working with a frantic energy she didn't know she possessed, Hannah wrestled the remaining rafters into place. Her height and strength gifts she had once cursed were now her greatest allies. She hammered pegs with furious, desperate blows, her mind racing. What was happening out there? What could one man, even a man like Samuel, do against Croft and his hired guns? As the sun began to set, casting a blood-red stain across the sky, the roof was done. It was rough, uneven, and far from perfect, but it was a solid covering. She dragged the heavy, unfinished door into place and dropped the thick oak bar Samuel had carved. The cabin was sealed. She was alone inside in the near darkness, with only a rifle and the sound of her own frantic heartbeat for company. Meanwhile, Samuel was not striding towards the Circle C ranch house. That would be foolish, a direct confrontation that would end with him full of bullets. He was a hunter, and he would hunt the man who had threatened his world. He moved through the woods with a ghostly silence, his immense size seeming to melt into the deepening shadows. He didn't go to the main house. He went to the line camp, a small shack where the ranch hands, including Cobb, often gathered to drink after their work. He waited hidden in the pines, his patience absolute. As predicted, Cobb and two other men who had been with Croft at the cabin site rode in, laughing and passing a bottle of whiskey. Samuel let them get comfortable. He waited until the fire was lit and they were distracted. Then he stepped out of the darkness. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The laughter died in their throats. The whiskey bottle slipped from a nerveless hand and shattered on the ground. They were staring at a phantom, a giant born of the night, his face grim as a death mask, the formidable axe held loosely at his side. The roof beam, Samuel said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of the forest. It was a poor trap. You tried to kill her. Cobb, ever the bully, tried to recover his swagger. He reached for the pistol on his hip. Now, you listen here, Injun. He never finished the sentence. Samuel crossed the 20 feet between them in 3 impossibly fast strides. He didn't use the axe. He grabbed Cobb's wrist with one hand, his grip like a band of iron. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the pistol clattered to the dirt. Cobb screamed a high, thin sound of pure agony. The other 2 men were frozen in terror, their own guns forgotten. Samuel turned his cold gaze on them. Leave the gun. Get on your horses. Ride out of this valley and do not come back. Tell every man you meet that the land by the creek is protected. If you return, I will not be so merciful. He released Cobb, who cradled his shattered wrist, whimpering. The 2 ranch hands scrambled for their horses, their faces pale with terror. They didn't need to be told twice. They galloped off into the night as if the devil himself were on their heels. Samuel looked down at the whimpering foreman. You will give Josiah Croft a message for me. Back in the cabin, hours had crawled by. Every creak of the new wood, every rustle of the wind, sent a jolt of fear through Hannah. Suddenly, she heard it, shouting, the thunder of hooves, not 1 or 2 horses, but many. They were coming. She peered through a small gap in the logs. Torchlight flickered through the trees, a swarm of angry fireflies. At their head was Josiah Croft, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. With him were at least 10 men, all armed. The sight of Cobb, pale and clutching his mangled hand, had sent Croft into a fury. The challenge was no longer subtle. It was open rebellion. Tlanuwa Croft roared, his voice cracking with rage. I know you're in there. You broke my foreman's hand. You think you can threaten me? On my own land. I'm tearing this shack down, board by board, and I'm burning what's left. He dismounted. Burn it, he commanded his men. Burn it to the ground. The men, emboldened by their numbers and Croft's fury, moved forward with their torches. Hannah raised her rifle, her hands trembling. She could maybe take 1, maybe 2, but then they would be on her. They would tear the door down. Just as the first man reached the wall of the cabin, a new sound split the night. A terrifying, high-pitched whistle, like a hawk's cry, amplified 100-fold. It came from the trees, from everywhere at once. And then the night exploded into chaos. From the darkness on the left flank, a massive shape rose up. Samuel. But he was not alone. Behind him, stepping silently out from behind trees and rocks, were 5 other men. They were Cherokee hunters, men from a small, hidden encampment miles away, men Samuel had summoned with a signal only they would know. They were not as large as Samuel, but they moved with the same deadly grace, armed with bows and knives, their faces painted for a fight. Croft's men froze, caught between the cabin and the silent, menacing figures that had materialized from the night. This is not your land, Croft. Samuel's voice boomed from the darkness. You have poisoned it with your greed. He pointed a long arm towards the rancher. You do not want this house. You want the water. You want the creek to choke it for yourself while the valley goes thirsty. The accusation hung in the air sharp and clear. Some of Croft's men, simple cowboys who were only here for the pay and the fight, glanced at each other with uncertainty. They had been told this was about punishing an attack on their foreman. They knew nothing of a water scheme. Lies. Croft shrieked, his composure shattering. He's a savage spreading lies. Fire on them, kill them all. He raised his own pistol and fired wildly into the darkness where Samuel stood. It was the signal for mayhem. One of the Cherokee hunters loosed an arrow that sliced through the torch of a ranch hand, plunging his side of the clearing into darkness. Hannah, seeing her chance, shoved the rifle through the gap in the logs and fired into the air. The gunshot from within the cabin, combined with the silent, deadly threat from the woods, sent Croft's men into a full-blown panic. This wasn't the easy fight they'd been promised. They were caught in a pincer, fighting against ghosts. Samuel moved then, a force of nature. He didn't charge the group. He went straight for Croft. He swept a cowboy aside with one arm and bore down on the rancher. Croft, fumbling to reload, looked up and saw the giant coming for him, his face a mask of righteous fury. He dropped his gun and screamed. It was over in moments. The ranch hands, their nerve broken, threw down their torches and fled into the night. Samuel's men did not pursue. They simply stood silent sentinels and let them go. Samuel grabbed Josiah Croft by the front of his shirt and lifted him effortlessly until the rancher's boots dangled a foot off the ground. "You are a thief and a coward," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The people in the town, they will know what you tried to do. They will know you would let their own cattle die of thirst to fill your own pockets." He threw Croft to the ground. "Go," he commanded, "and never come back to this valley." Croft scrambled to his feet, a broken, humiliated man. He gave one last, hateful look at the cabin at Samuel and then stumbled off into the darkness after his men. The clearing was suddenly silent, littered with discarded torches that sputtered in the dirt. Samuel turned to his kinsmen and spoke to them in their native tongue, a series of low, respectful words. They nodded, and as silently as they had appeared, they melted back into the forest. The night was still again. Hannah pushed the bar from the door and stepped out. Samuel stood in the center of the clearing, his chest heaving, his silhouette immense against the backdrop of the dying torchlight. Their eyes met across the space that had been a battlefield. She didn't run to him. She walked slowly, deliberately. She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could feel the heat rolling off his body. She looked at his bruised knuckles, at the fierce, protective fire that still burned in his eyes. And then she did something she never thought she would have the courage to do. She reached up her hand, gentle, and touched his face. He flinched just for a second, unused to such a tender touch. Then he leaned into her hand, his eyes closing for a brief moment. A shudder went through his massive frame. In the middle of the night, surrounded by the wreckage of a failed war, standing before the house they had built and defended together, Hannah Smith finally understood. This was home. Home wasn't a place of four walls and a roof. It was the fierce, unwavering gaze of the man who stood before her. It was the safety she felt in his presence, the strength he had shown her in herself. Without a word, she rose on her toes and he lowered his head. And there, in the quiet aftermath of the reckoning, their lips met for the first time. It was a kiss, not of fiery passion, but of profound, unshakable peace. A promise sealed. The sun rose on a changed world. The clearing, which had been a place of terror and violence, was now quiet and still. The scent of pine and damp earth mingled with the faint, acrid smell of burnt-out torches. The cabin stood not unscathed, but undefeated. Its rough-hewn walls were scorched in places, the ground around it trampled and scarred, but its foundation was solid. It was a testament, a survivor. Samuel and Hannah worked together to clean the clearing, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They gathered the discarded torches and buried them. They smoothed over the hoofprints and scuff marks in the dirt. They were not erasing the memory of the night before, but rather tidying up after a necessary, if violent, act of housekeeping. The threat had been purged. Later that morning, a lone rider approached. It was the town sheriff, a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a weary, pragmatic man who generally preferred to let the town's troubles sort themselves out. But a dozen terrified ranch hands, babbling about a forest full of Cherokee ghosts and a defeated Josiah Croft, was a trouble too big to ignore. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene, the sturdy cabin, the giant of a man standing beside it, and the tall woman who met his gaze, not with fear, but with a calm, steady confidence. "Heard there was a ruckus out here last night," Sheriff Thorne said, his voice neutral. "Mr. Croft came to visit Hannah," said simply. He expressed his disapproval of our construction. "He and his men have cleared out of the Circle C," Thorne stated, watching their reactions carefully. "Packed up and gone. The story they're telling is colorful." Samuel remained silent, letting Hannah speak. It was her home, her victory. "The truth is often simpler," Sheriff Hannah said. "Josiah Croft wanted this land for the water. He tried to drive us off first, with threats, then with sabotage. Last night he came to burn us out. We defended our home." Thorne nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the scorch marks on the logs. He had known Croft was a greedy, cruel man, but this was a new level of depravity. The valley was in a drought. To try and steal the last reliable water source was a crime against the entire community. "And the ghosts?" the sheriff asked, a hint of curiosity in his voice. Sometimes Samuel spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. When a man is defending his home, he finds he has more friends than he knew. Sheriff Thorne held his gaze for a long moment, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. The lawman knew he was out of his depth, and more importantly, he knew that justice in this case had already been served more swiftly and effectively than he ever could have managed. He tipped his hat. "Well, a man's home is his castle, I reckon, even if he built it himself." He turned his horse. "I'll be filing a report that Croft sold his ranch and moved on." Seems the simplest explanation. He rode away, leaving them to the peace they had fought for. The news that Josiah Croft was gone, and the reason for his sudden departure, spread through Redemption Gulch like a cleansing fire. The story was pieced together from the whispers of the few ranch hands who stayed behind, shamed into silence, and the undeniable fact of the ever-flowing creek on Hannah's land. The town's perception shifted. The mockery that had once been directed at Hannah and Samuel now turned on Croft's memory. He was not just a bully, but a thief who would have condemned them all to thirst for his own gain. The cabin by the creek was no longer seen as a freak's nest. It became a symbol of defiance against a tyrant. The Cherokee giant was no longer a feared recluse, but the man who had protected the valley's most precious resource. And the Smith giantess was no longer an awkward spinster, but a woman of formidable courage and resolve. People began to change. Martha Higgins, the storekeeper's wife, fell silent when the topic arose, her face flushed with a shame she was too proud to admit. Mr. Abernathy, the storekeeper, found himself looking Hannah in the eye when she came in for supplies, offering her a respectful nod. On one occasion, a farmer whose well was running dry came timidly to the cabin, hat in hand, and asked if he might fill a few barrels from their creek. Samuel looked at Hannah, who answered for them both. "Of course," she said, with a small smile. "The water is for everyone." Their life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and partnership. They finished the cabin, turning it from a shelter into a true home. Samuel, with his remarkable skill, built furniture scaled to their size. He built a long, sturdy bed where Hannah could finally stretch out completely. He built a table where they could sit opposite each other without their knees knocking. He built 2 tall, strong chairs that they placed on the porch facing the creek. It was in this house that they truly fell in love, not in a rush of passion, but in the slow, steady accumulation of shared moments, in the way he would gently touch the small of her back as they passed in the doorway, in the way she would save him the last piece of cornbread, in the comfortable silences they shared on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. One cool autumn evening, as they sat in their chairs, a comfortable quiet settled between them. Hannah leaned her head against the strong wood of the porch post. "Do you remember what Josiah Croft shouted at me?" she asked softly. "He said, I was too tall for a home." Samuel turned his head, his dark eyes soft in the twilight. He was looking at the walls, he said, not the foundation. He reached over and took her hand, his large, powerful fingers enveloping hers in a grip that was both strong and gentle. Her hand, which had always looked too large and clumsy next to the other women in town, felt perfectly wonderfully small in his. She looked at their intertwined hands, then at the solid, beautiful home they had built with them. She looked at the giant of a man beside her, the outcast who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. The mockery of the world seemed like a faint, distant echo from another lifetime. Here in this place they had forged from wood and will. She was not too tall. She was exactly the right size. She was home. The story of Hannah and Samuel Tlanuwa isn't just about the house they built with their hands. It's about building a life on a foundation of mutual respect and courage. They were 2 people cast out by society for being different, yet their supposed flaws, her height, his heritage, their combined strength became the very tools they used to carve out a place for themselves, and in doing so, expose the true ugliness of prejudice and greed. Their home became a beacon, proving that true strength isn't about conforming to the world's small-minded expectations, but about having the courage to build your own. If their story of defiance, love, and building a life against all odds moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story with heart. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramas and triumphs that shaped the wild heart of the West. Thank you for listening.